adds more hash, more static, more interference. The receiving antenna will pick up both the composite RF waves from the transmitting antenna and the random noises generated by the lightning. These two will combine and distort the amplitude of our desired signal. Now, a partial review of what happens in the AM receiver. The amplitude-modulated RF carrier is picked up by the receiver's antenna. The receiver extracts the intelligence carried by the RF, transforms it back to an audio signal, amplifies it, and feeds it to the speaker. It emerges from the speaker as sound waves, which can be heard and understood by the human ear, unless the intelligence is smothered by interference. To see how interference gets through to the speaker, one of the receiver components, the detector or demodulator, must be examined. The detector receives the RF and transforms its amplitude variations into corresponding audio voltage variations. The detector does its job well, but blindly. It cannot think or interpret. Feed it an RF signal with constant amplitude, and there will be no output signal. Feed it a modulated RF, and it will provide an audio signal which mirrors the amplitude variations of that RF. Feed it an RF signal that has been hashed up by interference, and the audio signal will contain an accurate reproduction of that same interference. The audio signal mirrors the interfered RF signal fed into the detector. There you have a major disadvantage of AM radio. It is unable to separate the intelligence from the hash and static that appear when conditions are unfavorable. In frequency modulation, the frequency of the carrier is modulated, as evidenced by the uneven spacing of the wave rather than the amplitude. An unmodulated carrier would be the same for FM as it is for AM. It has constant frequency and constant amplitude in its unmodulated condition. The carrier frequency, which is determined by the oscillator, is called the rest frequency. So long as there is no audio signal, the carrier is unaffected. Let's see what happens when an audio signal is applied, starting with the negative half cycle. For this illustration, the negative half cycle causes the carrier to drop below its rest frequency, as evidenced by the wider spaced wave. When the positive half cycle of the audio signal is added, it crosses above rest frequency. The carrier's ability to reflect the amplitude of the audio signal can be easily visualized. But how will it record changes in the frequency of the audio signal? This question can be answered by changing the frequency of the audio signal and observing the results in the carrier. If the frequency of the audio signal is doubled, then in the same period of time, there will be two complete cycles instead of one. Note that the amplitude of the two-cycle audio signal is the same as the amplitude of the single-cycle audio signal. Now let's see what this has done to the carrier. As before, the carrier responded to the amplitude of the negative half cycle by dropping below rest frequency, and the carrier responded to the amplitude of the positive half cycle by rising above rest frequency. Thus, the carrier has moved above rest frequency twice as often in the same interval of time, and the carrier has moved below rest frequency twice as often in the same period of time in response to the doubling of the audio signal frequency. But since the amplitude of the audio signal was not changed, the distance above and below rest frequency traveled by the carrier has remained constant. A typical FM channel, 40 megacycles, would be located here. This is the rest frequency of the channel. When the carrier is frequency modulated, it will move above and below its rest frequency. In other words, it will need room on the spectrum to carry its frequency variation. A typical amount of room might be 15 kilocycles above rest and 15 kilocycles below rest. To avoid conflict with adjacent FM channels, 10 kilocycle guard bands are added on each end. This typical channel will allow the carrier a 15 kilocycle deviation above and below its rest frequency. Add to this the 10 kilocycles on each end for guard bands, and the total band width is 50 kilocycles. The 50 kilocycle band width is not a standard. All FM transmitters do not have the same deviation. It will vary in accordance with the equipment's design and mission. but the principles under study apply to any and all FM transmitters. Ordinarily, an audio frequency wave is visualized horizontally like this. But in order to see more clearly its modulating effect on the carrier, let's shift it about and direct it at the channel. Notice that the amount of deviation above and below rest frequency is determined by the amplitude of the modulating signal. If we raise or lower the frequency of the modulating signal, we increase or decrease only the speed at which the carrier moves above and below its rest frequency. We do not change the extent of its deviation. Only by changing the amplitude of the modulating signal do we change, decrease, or increase the extent of deviation above and below rest. FM circuitry is designed so that the maximum amplitude of the modulating signal will cause the carrier to deviate from the maximum frequency range assigned to it. Note that this does not include the guard band, or in other words, the carrier will swing as far above and below its rest frequency as it can go. Now that we are familiar with the basic principles of FM, let's make a quick rundown of the components that make it possible. The transmitter's components are similar in name to their AM equivalent, and they do similar jobs, but in a different way. The audio circuits provide the audio frequency signal, which is fed through the modulator. The action of the modulator is such that the output of the oscillator is a frequency modulated RF wave. The components of the FM receiver are a bit more complex, so they have an additional factor to contend with. The incoming carrier contains intelligence in the form of frequency variation, but it also contains amplitude distortion, hash, and static. These we do not want. Since these distortions are located along the amplitude peaks of the carrier, we can eliminate them by eliminating the peak. This is accomplished by a circuit that clips the peak by limiting the amount of current flow induced by the positive and negative alternations of the carrier.